The first sign came in a whispered phone call that seemed to hang in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor longer than the words themselves. Lieutenant Claire Hensley, the administrative officer charged with coordinating the new arrivals, gripped the receiver a little too tightly, the plastic warm against her palm. She had processed hundreds of incoming units over her career, each a carefully cataloged sequence of manifests, schedules, and billeting forms. This, she realized almost immediately, was different. The voice on the other end, low, deliberate, almost conspiratorial, didn't say what to do. It didn't need to. It said only enough for her to know that the machinery of the base was quietly shifting to accommodate something it could not officially acknowledge. A caution had been passed down, informal, unwritten, and entirely serious. A warning nobody had thought to put on paper. Outside, the transport vehicles rumbled onto the tarmac, their tires kicking up dust in lazy arcs, engines humming like nervous insects in the morning sun. Soldiers climbed down, rifles slung casually, gear stacked with precise familiarity. They moved as if the base itself were merely scenery, unaware of the attention spiraling around them. Hensley watched them from the office doorway, noting how the arrival's calm confidence set every host soldier on edge, though no one dared say so aloud. Their steps were deliberate, measured, ordinary, and yet the air around them felt electric, charged with an authority that had preceded them, palpable before they even unpacked their packs. Inside the administration wing, clerks shifted papers more carefully than necessary, as if each sheet might betray the presence of these newcomers. Keyboards clicked softly in syncopated anxiety. The scent of coffee mingled with the antiseptic tang of floor wax. But beneath it, Hensley could feel the tension layering the room like static. She could see it in the brief glances between officers, in the quick, precise movements of a corporal redirecting a visitor, in the way even the base's standard-issue radio chatter carried an undercurrent of anticipatory caution. From the arrival's perspective, nothing seemed amiss. Private Tom Keegan carried his duffel bag with ease, adjusting the strap over his shoulder as he passed the hangars and barracks. To him, this was just another insertion, another base on a map, another sequence in the endless cycle of deployment. He smiled briefly at a desk sergeant, nodding in greeting, entirely unaware that each smile, each gesture, was being measured and catalogued by eyes trained not just for procedure, but for anomaly. The contrast between Keegan's casual demeanor and the meticulous, almost nervous choreography around him was subtle, yet unmistakable, an invisible dance of anticipation and unease that only those within the system could perceive. Hensley followed a billeting manifest down the hall, her footsteps echoing against cinder-block walls, each tapping a reminder that she was now responsible for translating the whispered caution into operational reality without ever putting words to it. She caught a glimpse of a sergeant in the corner, leaning against the wall, whispering into his radio, glancing toward the arrivals as though trying to predict the unpredictable. Every clerk, every officer, every junior soldier seemed suspended in that moment of quiet reckoning, the base itself holding its breath, aware that what was coming could not be rehearsed, contained, or mitigated in any conventional way. Outside, the sun fell across the tarmac, glinting off helmet visors, casting long, sharp shadows across the sand and asphalt. Dust lingered in the air like smoke from a fire nobody could see. The arrivals moved in formations that were casual yet precise, an unspoken rhythm that drew the eye without demanding attention. Hensley, watching from the doorway, felt a tickling unease in her chest, an institutional humor almost dark enough to be uncomfortable, the joke that no one would ever officially acknowledge. This was not a unit that would announce its presence with fanfare. Its reputation traveled ahead of it, whispered along the corridors of power, reaching ears and eyes long before the men and women themselves touched the ground. By the time the paperwork was sorted, the bunks assigned, the initial briefings conducted, the quiet warning had already circulated. It had moved faster than forms, faster than phones, faster than any memo. Hensley understood, finally, that the machinery she served, the processes and hierarchies she trusted, was only marginally prepared for what had arrived. She caught Keegan's eye as he adjusted a strap and gave a half-smile, a soldier unaware of the effect of his very presence. The unease, the attention, the careful choreography, it all emanated from a simple fact. This unit had earned a warning system so reliable it preceded them everywhere, at every base in every time zone, without a single report ever being written down. And in that quiet, electric moment, Hensley understood that nothing in the manuals, nothing in her training, could have prepared her for what was coming next. Before a reputation becomes a warning, before it turns into a phrase spoken quietly at the edge of a parade ground, you have to understand the ecosystem that carries it. Because military bases do not run solely on orders and signal traffic, they run on something older, quieter, and often far more reliable. Regimental Sergeant Major Colin McAllister had been on bases long enough to see 3 generations of doctrine rewritten and quietly ignored. He stood most evenings in the same place, the concrete apron outside the vehicle shed, near the smoking drums, where engines ticked as they cooled and the air carried that familiar blend of diesel, canvas, and sweat baked into fabric. The official day ended with a final formation. The real day began afterward. Young troopers lingered, helmets dangling from fingertips, boots unlaced halfway. Corporals compared notes in low voices. A warrant officer might drift past without appearing to listen, catching every word. Mac watched it all with the faint, almost imperceptible nod of a man who understood that this was where the institution breathed. The manuals would tell you that information moves through formal channels after action reports, operational summaries, intelligence briefs, clean fonts, approved language, time-stamped and archived. But Mac knew that the most durable intelligence never touched a printer. It moved through the sergeant's mess, through cookhouse queues, through the 2-minute phone call between old platoon mates now posted to different regiments. It moved in fragments, in tone, in raised eyebrows. He had shaped that network for decades, sometimes without realizing it. A quiet comment in the right company, a warning phrased as a joke, a name said without elaboration. Keep them away, he had heard once, spoken not as a complaint but as a professional assessment. The kind of assessment that makes other senior NCOs pause mid-sip and store it for later. Private Liam Blue Harris encountered this world for the first time on a humid afternoon that smelled faintly of wet concrete and burnt coffee. He had been in uniform for 6 months and still believed that the chain of command was a straight, visible ladder. He stood in the cookhouse line, tray balanced awkwardly, listening as 2 lance corporals ahead of him talked in clipped, efficient sentences. They were operating up north last rotation. Yeah, different tempo. That's what I heard. Blue leaned in without meaning to. No one had raised their voice. No one had offered detail. But there was weight in the way the unit's name landed, like a tool set down carefully. He would later ask his section commander what it meant. The answer came with a faint smile. It means if they're in your battle space, you pay attention. That was how the network worked. Not dramatic, not loud, precise. Mac would explain it this way. Formal communications exist to protect the institution. Informal communications exist to protect the soldier. The difference is subtle but absolute. If a vehicle type had a recurring fault the paperwork hadn't yet acknowledged, the drivers would know within hours. If a training area had a blind corner where accidents happened, new arrivals were told before their first convoy. And if a unit had demonstrated something extraordinary, something that bent expectations without breaking rules, the two would travel faster than any directive. What made it remarkable was its accuracy. Military gossip is not a random rumor. It is filtered by professionals who understand consequence. A wild exaggeration dies quickly in a culture where credibility is currency. A precise warning, on the other hand, hardens into institutional memory. Mac had watched reputations rise and fall over decades. Units known for discipline, units known for chaos, units that looked impressive on parade but wilted under pressure. Most reputations were local and temporary, confined to a brigade or a deployment cycle. They faded as personnel rotated. But occasionally, something different happened. A story repeated itself across bases separated by thousands of kilometers. The same phrase surfaced independently in Darwin, in Townsville, in a dusty transit hub overseas. It arrived through different mouths but carried identical tones. Blue began noticing it in small moments. A visiting NCO mentioned those blokes with a sideways glance, a logistics sergeant advising extra caution when coordinating with a particular detachment. No one spelled it out, no PowerPoint slide existed, yet the message was consistent: keep them away. What fascinated Mac was not the admiration, though there was plenty of that, but the edge beneath it. The people passing the phrase along were not recruits dazzled by myth. They were seasoned operators who had seen combat, who had buried friends, who had learned to distrust hype. For them to amplify a reputation meant it had survived contact with reality. In the sergeant's mess, reputations were dissected clinically. Over bitter coffee and cheap biscuits, senior NCOs would trade assessments with the emotional detachment of mechanics discussing machinery. Did they cut corners? No. Did they chase glory? No. Were they aggressive? Yes. Were they predictable? No. That last word mattered. Predictability is comfort in military systems. It allows planners to model outcomes, to forecast behavior. A unit that consistently behaves inside the expected envelope is easy to integrate. A unit that operates just beyond it without violating discipline creates friction. Blue felt that friction the first time he trained alongside them. It wasn't obvious at first. They weren't louder. They weren't swaggering. In fact, they were almost understated. But their tempo was different. Their pauses were shorter. Their preparation seemed obsessive in small details others glossed over. It was as if they were rehearsing for consequences heavier than the exercise demanded. He mentioned it to Mac one evening by the vehicle shed, the sky turning the color of cooling steel. Mac exhaled slowly, watching smoke drift sideways in the breeze. Reputation isn't about noise, he said. It's about consistency under pressure. Word only spreads when the pressure's real. The informal network did not romanticize. It was measured. It was compared. It was memorable. And this particular reputation had moved with unusual speed, faster than official commendations, faster than operational summaries. It had crossed regimental boundaries and service lines. It had reached soldiers who had never directly worked with the unit, yet spoke of them with quiet certainty. That was the part that unsettled Mac. For seasoned professionals, men and women hardened by repetition to feel compelled to pass along a warning, something must have disrupted expectations at a structural level. Blue sensed it too, though he couldn't articulate why. The phrase carried a dual meaning. It was respect. It was a caution. It was a recognition that proximity to this unit changed the shape of operations around them. If the informal network was this fast, this precise, this resistant to exaggeration, then whatever these soldiers had done was not theatrical. It was demonstrable, repeatable, documented in memory rather than paperwork, and that raises the question neither Mac nor Blue could ignore. What did they actually do on the ground, under pressure that made experienced soldiers, people who had seen everything, feel the need to lean in close and say it quietly? Keep them away. The story does not begin with the abort call. It begins years earlier, on a base that smelled permanently of diesel, eucalyptus, and wet canvas. Long before the warning circulated in official channels, before the whispered briefings and the careful phrasing and exercise directives, there was a single incident that felt minor at the time, incremental, almost administrative. And yet, every man who was there remembers the exact hour of the day, the exact angle of the sun on the tin-roofed vehicle sheds, and the exact moment when two institutional cultures collided without either fully understanding what the other was built to do. Sergeant Mark Houck Callahan remembers the sound first. Not gunfire, not shouting, the metallic slap of a loose antenna against the side of a Land Rover as it idled near the perimeter wire. It was late afternoon, heat still radiating off the bitumen in soft waves. The base operated on predictable rhythms: vehicle maintenance in the morning, range rotations in the afternoon, paperwork before last light. Order was not just encouraged here, it was assumed. The host battalion had spent years refining a choreography of movement platoons stepping off on schedule, radio traffic disciplined, ranges cleared in precise sequence. Then Hawk's detachment arrived. They were young by comparison, lean and unbothered by ceremony, carrying themselves with the relaxed tension of men accustomed operating without supervision. They had been selected for adaptability, aggression, and initiative. Their doctrine emphasized tempo over comfort, initiative over permission. They were not reckless. They were optimized. Hawk can still see the base from the back of the truck that first evening, neatly painted rocks lining pathways, signage with clear directional arrows, a parade square bleached by sun and habit, It felt to him like stepping into a museum of predictability. He does not say that with contempt. He says it with a complicated kind of affection. We weren't there to disrupt, he insists now, decades later. We were there to train. Captain Andrew Mercer, then a junior operations officer on that host base, remembers a different first impression. He remembers watching the detachment unload their kit with alarming speed, bypassing the check-in desk to move directly toward the training area, as if the base were already theirs. There was no overt insubordination, no shouting, just velocity. A pace of decision-making that seemed to ignore the carefully established layers of approval that governed everything on that installation. The incident itself began small, a combined night navigation and live fire coordination exercise designed to test interoperability. On paper, it was straightforward. The host battalion would secure phase line Alpha. Hawk's detachment would conduct a simulated infiltration and mark targets for a follow-on element. Boundaries were clearly drawn. Timelines were generous. But Hawk's team did what they had been trained to do. They moved early. They moved fast. And when they encountered what they interpreted as a gap seam in the host battalion's outer security, they exploited it. From Hawk's perspective, it was a textbook. Darkness folding over scrubland, the air cooling enough that breath no longer hung visibly. The crunch of gravel beneath careful boots. A single red chem-light marking a rally point. They identified a blind spot in the host unit's picket line, a stretch of fence partially obscured by a vehicle park, not a catastrophic flaw, a detail, a seam. They slid through it. Inside the perimeters, the base at night felt different. Generators hummed with low, mechanical patience. Distant laughter from the mess hall drifted in fragments. The fluorescent lights over the motor pool cast hard white rectangles onto the dirt. Hawk's pulse did not spike. It sharpened. This was the work. Identify weakness. Move. Adapt. They marked simulated high-value assets. A communications node, a fuel cache, a command post-tet, all within the parameters of the exercise, no rules technically broken. But when the umpires tallied the results at first light, the numbers were uncomfortable. The host battalion had, on paper, been penetrated to its operational core in under 45 minutes. Captain Mercer remembers the silence in the operations room when the overlays were compared. Not anger. Not yet. Silence. The kind that signals cognitive dissonance. The plan had been sound. The procedures had been followed. The sentries had been posted. And yet, what complicated everything was what happened next. Instead of stepping back after achieving their objectives, Hawk's team continued probing, not out of arrogance, he insists, but habit. In their doctrine, success was not a stopping point. It was an invitation to stress the system further. They tested response times. They triggered secondary alarms. They forced radio traffic into congestion. Within 90 minutes, the host battalion's command net was saturated. From the outside, it looked like chaos. From inside Hawk's detachment, it felt like proof of concept. The first thing that went wrong was not a firefight or an injury. It was a tone shift. The base commander's voice on the net carried a controlled tightness that everyone recognized. Exercises were meant to validate capability, not expose systemic fragility in front of attached observers. And there were observers, senior officers from other units, a visiting doctrinal review team. In the immediate aftermath, the debrief was clinical. Slides presented. Timelines reconstructed. Hawk remembers the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the faint smell of burnt coffee in the urn near the back wall. The host battalion's defensive posture had been compromised. The word appeared 3 times in the after-action summary. What was not entered into the official record was what Captain Mercer said once the junior ranks had been dismissed. "You were correct," Mercer admitted, voice low, hands flat on the folding table. "But you were not collaborative." Hawk felt the ambiguity of that sentence like a weight. Correct, but not collaborative. In his training culture, correctness, measured in outcome, was the highest currency. In Mercer's, cohesion across units mattered just as much as tactical dominance. The friction was not about rules, it was about philosophy. Mercer admits now that he felt something unspoken in that room. A flicker of reluctant admiration. The detachment had revealed vulnerabilities that needed fixing. They had stress-tested assumptions the battalion had not questioned in years, but they had done so in a way that disrupted hierarchy, compressed timelines, and embarrassed leadership in front of peers. The warning that would later circulate did not accuse the unit of misconduct. It cautioned host bases to anticipate aggressive tempo and ensure clear boundaries. The language was polite, sanitized, but everyone who had been there understood its origin. Hawk carries the memory with ambivalence. He is proud of the efficiency, proud of the discipline under darkness, the clean execution, but he also remembers Mercer's face under the fluorescent white, composed, analytical, and faintly unsettled. That was the first time Hawk understood that excellence can be destabilizing. The legend that grew afterward flattened the nuance. It became a story of chaos, of a base overrun in humiliation. That version is cleaner, easier to tell, but the origin was more human. It was about doctrine meeting doctrine, about a unit trained to accelerate encountering a system built to regulate. And as Mercer reflects now, older and more candid, he does not regret what happened. They showed us something, he says. We just weren't ready to see it that way. That first incident did not generate scandal. It generated a pattern. Each subsequent base would add a new layer, different terrain, different commanders, different sensitivities, but the underlying friction remained. Aggressive tempo against structured predictability, outcome against optics, initiative against hierarchy. If that was only the beginning, if that was the mildest version of the collision, then the question lingers like heat over asphalt. What happened at the bases that followed, when the observers were more senior, the stakes higher, and the appetite for discomfort far lower? The first time they heard about it, it was almost a joke. The warning arrived before they did. A thin email, a phone call that lasted less than 3 minutes, a passing comment from a logistics officer who tried to keep his voice neutral and failed. Just be aware, he said. They operate differently. By the time the aircraft wheels kissed the runway, the rumor had already outrun them. Corporal Mason felt it the moment the rear ramp lowered. Same choreography as always. Engines whining down, heat radiating off tarmac. The metallic clatter of the kit dragged onto concrete. But the eyes were different. Host unit personnel stood a little farther back than usual, arms folded, faces unreadable. Mason adjusted the strap cutting into his shoulder and pretended not to notice. Inside the unit, the mood was almost amused. They had heard fragments of the story from the previous Base to Shire routine joint exercise had stretched into something less routine. How training boundaries had been interpreted creatively. How the after-action report had described unexpected tempo escalation in language so carefully it almost felt poetic. From their perspective, nothing extraordinary had happened. They had been given objectives. They had achieved them faster than anticipated. They had pushed scenarios until they felt real. From the host base's perspective, something else had occurred. At Base 1, the friction was subtle. A night navigation exercise extended past its scheduled cutoff. Mason remembered the darkness that evening, thick, almost wet, swallowing the thin red glow of headlamps. Their team moved by instinct, not timeline. They identified gaps in perimeter coverage the scenario designers hadn't intended to exist. They exploited them. At 0200 hours, a startled staff officer found his simulated command post overrun, not by aggression, but by precision. Radios confiscated, positions marked, lessons delivered without theatrics. The next morning, the air smelled faintly of damp canvas and embarrassment. In the debrief, language tightened, excessive initiative, misaligned interpretation of scenario parameters. No accusations, just discomfort. The warning traveled. By the time they arrived at Base 2, it had evolved. This time, the reception included a formal briefing. A major stood in front of a projection screen displaying exercise constraints in bold font, safety margins emphasized, boundaries underlined. Mason sat in the back row, hands clasped loosely, aware of the shift. The humor inside the unit thinned slightly. They were no longer anonymous participants. They were a variable to be managed. The second incident carried less innocence. During a live-fire rehearsal, the host unit followed the script exactly, movement by numbers. Cover arcs rehearsed to perfection. Mason's team, observing, saw latency, microseconds where decisions waited for confirmation. They adjusted, not recklessly, just faster. When the simulation flipped and roles reversed, they collapsed to defensive position in half the projected time. Smoke hung in the air, acrid and stinging. Blank rounds cracked against plywood structures. One host sergeant lowered his weapon afterward, breathing hard, eyes narrowed not in anger but recalculation. The paperwork that followed was thicker. Recommendations were suggested. Future integration guidelines drafted. The ledger gained another entry. At Base 3, the warning was no longer discreet. It preceded them in a formal coordination call. A colonel, voice steady but deliberate, asked for clarification. Are we expecting deviations from established training protocols? The answer, diplomatically phrased, avoided specifics. Mason felt the weight of it during arrival. The unloading choreography had become ritualistic, boots on gravel, manifests signed, temporary access badges issued. But now there were observers, not curious soldiers, administrators, compliance officers, inside the unit. Conversations shifted tone. Reputation is intoxicating at first, then it becomes a mirror. Mason wondered quietly whether they were being measured not for performance but for restraint. The third incident did not involve speed. It involved interpretation. An urban training block, tight corridors, simulated civilians woven unpredictably into the scenario. The host doctrine required verbal confirmation at every threshold. Mason's team read body language instead, angles of posture, hesitation patterns. They bypassed a choke point entirely by accessing a maintenance crawl space no one had considered tactically relevant. When they emerged behind the opposing element, the exercise controller's whistle blew long and sharp. The silence afterward felt heavier than any gunfire. From the command perspective, this was the moment discomfort crystallized. A lieutenant colonel reviewed helmet camera footage in a dim operations room, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. He replayed the crawl space maneuver twice. It was clever, it was effective, it was scripted. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. The reputation was no longer anecdotal, it was operational. Yet no official memorandum existed. The warnings moved through informal channels, calls between peers, off-the-record emails, phrases like, "Prepare accordingly." No document labeled the unit problematic. No disciplinary action materialized. But each base added a layer to the myth. Inside the team, the awareness grew sharper. Mason noticed the way host soldiers studied them during meals. Conversations stopped half a second too late. Jokes carried a thin edge. They were admired. They were resented, sometimes simultaneously. The fourth base marked the shift from dark comedy to tension, an exercise designed explicitly to contain them. Additional oversight embedded, boundaries narrowed, evaluators positioned at key decision nodes. It was almost theatrical, the institution attempting to outmaneuver its own creation. The environment was dry, dust hanging in sunlit air, vehicles idling with a low mechanical growl. Mason felt the constraint immediately, every route pre-briefed, every contingency anticipated, and yet unpredictability lives in human timing. When a simulated casualty altered the scenario midstream, post commanders hesitated, waiting for confirmation through proper channels. Mason's team acted. They redistributed assets, redefined the objective, completed the extraction before the updated directive reached them. Afterward, in the debrief room, no one laughed. A senior officer cleared his throat. Words were chosen carefully. Were chosen carefully. Exceptional initiative, he began, then paused. We need to discuss alignment. Alignment. The word lingered like smoke. Somewhere in the network, someone in an official position had to decide whether this pattern required acknowledgement. Not punishment, just classification. But classification creates record. Record creates permanence. Permanence invites scrutiny, so nothing was written. Instead, the warning continued to travel without letterhead. By the fifth posting, arrival felt almost ceremonial. Mason stepped off the aircraft into familiar choreography, but this time the host commander met them personally. A handshake held half a second too long. "We've heard about you," he said, smiling without smiling. Inside the unit there was no triumph, only a tightening awareness that reputation changes terrain. Every action now carried interpretive weight. Was this initiative or provocation? Adaptation or defiance? The irony was inescapable. They had not changed their behavior. The environment had changed around them. And across bases, the physical evidence accumulated quietly. Training areas left more efficiently cleared than expected. Equipment logs noting unusual usage patterns. After-action reports phrased in neutral tones that masked unease. a paper trail that described everything except the feeling that something slightly beyond doctrine had taken place. Reputation became a presence of its own, unseen, unsigned, but increasingly real. From inside the unit, it felt like momentum. From outside, it felt like erosion. The legend compounded base by base, growing not through misconduct, but through discomfort. Each new posting added another data point to an argument no one wanted to formalize, because formalization would force a choice: acknowledge that adaptive effectiveness had outpaced institutional comfort, or insist that everything remained within acceptable bounds and risk losing control of the narrative. The strangest part was not what happened, it was what never appeared in any official archive. No reprimand, no commendation, no doctrine amendment, just a warning that traveled faster than aircraft. And somewhere, at a desk in a building far from dust and darkness, someone had already noticed the pattern. The question was not whether the reputation was accurate. The question was whether the institution would ever admit that it existed. By the time the reputation reached headquarters, it no longer sounded like a rumor. It sounded like weather persistent, hard to measure, impossible to ignore. The senior officer who first received the warning remembers the room more clearly than the words. Fluorescent light humming overhead, Venetian blinds half tilted against the afternoon glare, a folder placed on the table without ceremony, thin enough to appear harmless. Inside it, exercise summaries, after-action reports, signal traffic transcripts. Nothing overtly insubordinate, no direct violations that could not be administratively explained, and yet, between the lines, a pattern. He had served long enough to recognize institutional friction before it sparked flame. Units that moved too independently, junior leaders who interpreted the commander's intent with unnerving elasticity, a culture forming just beyond the edge of formal doctrine. He did not see recklessness, he saw capability. But capability untethered makes bureaucracies nervous. Across the table, another colonel spoke carefully, never using the word that was already circulating informally. They describe initiative beyond assigned parameters, aggressive interpretation of scenario objectives, operational independence. The language was antiseptic. No one said what everyone understood. This unit was building a reputation for doing what worked, not what was written. The senior officer made a decision that afternoon that would shape the next decade. He chose silence, not denial, not endorsement, silence. Formally acknowledging the reputation would have forced classification. Once named, it would require policy response. Either the behavior would have to be curtailed, bringing it into doctrinal alignment, or formally adopted, which would ripple outward through training pipelines, promotion boards, funding justifications. Either path carried risk. Suppression might dull an emerging tactical edge. Institutional adoption might fracture a culture unprepared for decentralized autonomy. So the reports continued to end one line short of significance. Meeting minutes captured attendance but not the subtext. Recommendations referenced, lessons identified without detailing their origin. The unit's performance statistics were folded into broader operational summaries, their distinctiveness diluted by aggregation. On paper, they were unremarkable. In practice, they were anything but. The senior officer would later admit that the silence protected two things at once. It protected the institution from having to publicly reconcile with its own contradictions, and it protected the unit from being reshaped before it had finished evolving. But protection has a cost. The unit member we have followed since the jungle patrols of Section 3 felt it long before he could articulate it. He would deploy, perform, return, and sit through briefings where his team's actions were summarized in generic language. No citation of the specific maneuver that prevented a larger engagement. No acknowledgement of the calculated risk that saved time, resources, perhaps lives. Their work was known in whispers and corridor conversations, in the nod between officers who understood, but it was never recorded in the language that shapes careers. He began to understand that he belonged to something both powerful and officially non-existent. In Iraq, during the early rotation into Al-Muthanna province, his patrol executed a night infiltration that bypassed a predictable route in favor of a dry irrigation channel mapped only through ground reconnaissance. It shaved minutes off their approach, avoided a potential ambush site, and resulted in a clean objective capture without shots fired. The debrief praised adaptive route selection, The battalion report logged objective secured, no casualties. The innovation dissolved into statistics. He did not crave medals, but he felt the absence. The senior officer understood that, too. He had once commanded men in similar circumstances. He knew that recognition is not vanity, it is validation. It tells soldiers that their judgment is trusted, not merely tolerated. Yet formal validation would have forced scrutiny. Scrutiny invites standardization. Standardization might sterilize the very unpredictability that made the unit effective, so he maintained the informal system, phone calls instead of memoranda, quiet taskings routed through trusted intermediaries, selective pairing of that unit with commanders who understood their operating philosophy. He became a gatekeeper between two worlds, the rigid architecture of official doctrine and the fluid improvisational culture thriving just beneath it. He told himself it was stewardship, and perhaps it was, but the men carrying out missions under that silent umbrella experienced something more ambiguous. They were relied upon when objectives were sensitive, when terrain was complex, when failure would be politically expensive. Yet in public briefings, their names did not surface. Their distinctive methods were not taught broadly. Younger units adopted fragments of their approach without knowing its origin. They became a ghost influence. There is a peculiar loneliness in being indispensable and unacknowledged at the same time. It shapes identity. The unit member would joke about it in mess halls. If it went well, it never happened. Laughter, brief and sharp. Underneath it, something harder, a recognition that institutional affection was conditional. The senior officer wrestled privately with that tension. He understood calculus. A military cannot be governed by exceptions. Doctrine requires clarity. Accountability requires traceability. To formally bless a culture of elastic interpretation risked eroding the very hierarchy that sustains large formations. Yet war does not reward rigidity. The silence, then, was a compromise. It allowed the behavior to continue without forcing the institution to publicly redefine itself. It created space for innovation while preserving the appearance of uniformity. But compromises accumulate. When the decision eventually came to restructure, to disperse elements of the unit into other formations, facetiously framed as modernization, integration, force optimization, the reputation was not mentioned. The paperwork cited efficiency and alignment with strategic priorities. No document acknowledged the cultural phenomenon being redistributed. On the day the reassignments were announced, the unit member stood in a hangar that smelled of hydraulic fluid and canvas. Equipment cases stacked against concrete, faces he had known for years avoiding prolonged eye contact. They were not being punished. They were not being celebrated. They were being absorbed. He wondered whether the reputation would survive dilution. The senior officer signed the orders with steady penmanship. He believed the lessons had already permeated enough layers to endure. Culture, once seeded, rarely disappears entirely. It mutates. It hides in habits. In how a junior leader interprets a vague instruction. In how a patrol commander chooses a route not suggested by satellite imagery. Years later, when asked whether he regretted the silence, the senior officer pauses. The question lingers in the air like dust in late sunlight. "We protected something," he says carefully. "I'm just not certain we protected it from everything." The unit member, now older, carries a different uncertainty. If the reputation outlived them, who controls its narrative? Does it become myth, stripped of nuance, or does it dissolve into institutional folklore, remembered only by those who felt its weight firsthand? The training ground is quiet again, but the echo remains. When a young officer somewhere chooses initiative over instruction and succeeds, is that lineage traceable, or has the origin already blurred beyond recognition? When the unit was broken up on paper, did the reputation die, or did it simply become harder to see? In militaries around the world, similar silences exist, carefully maintained gaps between what is written and what is known. They protect institutions from contradiction. They protect soldiers from premature standardization. And sometimes they protect neither fully. What endures is not the paperwork. It is the habit of mind. And habits, once learned under pressure, rarely stay buried. The phrase was never written down, no directive, no memorandum, no formal policy buried in an annex. Just a quiet sentence passed from one command team to the next. Keep them away. Regimental Sergeant Major Mick Delaney sits alone now in a dim office, long after the parade ground is emptied. The fluorescent light hums overhead. On the wall behind him hang framed photographs of deployments, faces blurred by dust and time. Operational citations list objectives achieved, distances covered, targets secured. They say nothing about personality. Mick runs a thumb along the edge of a folder that contains glowing performance summaries, tactical excellence, initiative, independent action under pressure. He exhales slowly. What they meant, he says, voice low, measured, was keep them away from the rest of the machine. The words are not bitter, they are analytical. Across the city, Dr. Amelia Hart closes a laptop filled with comparative case studies. She has traced similar warnings in other militaries, elite airborne units in post-war Europe, long-range reconnaissance teams in Southeast Asia, special operations elements inside NATO commands, different uniforms, different flags, same whispered caution. They are brilliant, the reports say, and they are difficult. The warning is not about incompetence, it is about friction. Mick remembers the first time he heard it said aloud, a brigade staff officer half joking over coffee. We'll use them when we need them, but keep them away from the conventional boys. The room laughed, but the laughter carried something else in acknowledgement, that the unit's culture did not fit neatly inside the institutional architecture surrounding it. On paper, militaries are built on hierarchy, predictability, and compliance. Orders flow downward, reports flow upward. Every deviation is documented, corrected. But special operations, particularly those forged in the Larkin inheritance Mick carries in his bones, are built on something looser. Initiative that borders on irreverence, confidence that can look like arrogance, a willingness to bend form in order to preserve function. Dr. Hart describes it as structural tension. You train individuals to operate autonomously in chaos, she explains, and then you reinsert them into a bureaucracy designed to minimize chaos. The friction is inevitable. The phrase, keep them away, is not an insult. It is a pressure management system. From the perspective of the institution, calculus is pragmatic. Elite units produce outsized operational returns. They move faster. They improvise better. They accept risks that conventional formations cannot, but their internal culture, intense loyalty laterally, selective deference vertically, can disrupt cohesion if dispersed carelessly. In another country, decades earlier, an airborne brigade returning from combat found itself isolated from the regular army for similar reasons. Their aggression was admired in battle. Their informality was questioned in barracks. A defense researcher interviewed years later would summarize it bluntly: you can't mass-produce that mindset, and you can't fully domesticate it either. Nick understands this without academic language. He has watched younger commanders attempt to normalize his soldiers, sharpen the edges, and force stricter conformity in dress, speech, posture. Sometimes it worked superficially. Boots aligned, haircuts immaculate, salutes crisp, but something else dimmed. He saw hesitation creep into eyes that once scanned terrain instinctively. He heard jokes disappear from patrol briefings where humor once diffused fear. The same traits that made the unit formidable in darkness began to erode under fluorescent light. The unit member from years earlier, Callum, the young trooper who once moved through jungle night with predatory calm, described it differently when we last heard from him. Out there, he said, you think for yourself. Back here, you're reminded not to. He did not say it with rebellion. He said it with fatigue. Institutions track outputs, missions completed, casualty ratios, strategic effects. They struggle to measure character. The informal warning system, keep them away, emerges as an adaptation, a recognition that excellence at the edge does not always integrate smoothly at the center. Dr. Hart leans forward when she says this next part. Every military in the world has units it warns others about, she explains. The ones that are too aggressive, too independent, too different, and almost none of them ever publicly explain why. Because to explain it is to admit that the institution depends on traits it cannot fully control. The camera lingers not on action footage now, but on absence. An empty mess hall table once occupied by men whose laughter carried too loudly. A whiteboard erased clean, leaving faint ghost marks of operational plans. A hallway where boots once echoed with informal confidence, now silent. The warning is not exile. It is containment. Mick closes the folder in front of him. He does not resent the phrase. In a strange way, he respects it. It means the system recognizes the power it has created. Every army, he says finally, needs its disruptors. Doesn't mean it's comfortable with them. The gravity of that statement settles. This is not an Australian anomaly, not a quirk of national temperament or historical accident. It is structural. The sharper the spear, the harder it is to sheath without drawing blood. Elite units are forged to operate beyond normal limits, physical, psychological, moral. They are selected for traits that, in civilian society, might appear abrasive. In conventional military culture, they can appear destabilizing. Yet in the precise moments when uncertainty fractures command and darkness swallows predictability, those same traits become decisive. The institution both suppresses and depends on them. And so the warning persists, not as condemnation, but as acknowledgement. Keep them away. Use them when the terrain demands it, when the silence is thick, when the plan collapses and someone must improvise without waiting for permission. Then return them to the margins. The documentary has traced a century of this pattern from muddy ridgelines to suffocating jungle to modern training grounds baked in red dust. The phrase is simply the most distilled expression of it. Every military institution in the world carries a version of that sentence. Almost none of them have ever explained it, because to explain it fully would require admitting that the very qualities that win wars are often the ones that refuse to sit comfortably inside peace, and that tension between order and edge, between hierarchy and instinct, has never truly been resolved. It has only ever been managed. The base looks smaller now, same gravel crunch beneath boots, same corrugated roofs flashing white under a hard Australian sun. The flag still snaps in the wind at precisely 0800, and the administrative office still smells faintly of paper, toner, and reheated coffee. On the surface, nothing has changed. Captain Erin Walsh stands behind the same counter she stood behind years ago, when the warning first came down in a voice too casual to be official and too deliberate to be ignored. If they're coming through your base, secure what you can, lock what matters. Don't expect them to follow your rhythm. Back then, she had bristled at it, the implication that her systems, her order, were temporary things, that someone could move through and bend them without formally breaking them. Now, she runs her hand across the same laminated sign-in ledger, the edges softened by time. She knows which drawers jam. She knows which sergeant keeps an unofficial key ring. She knows that institutional memory rarely travels in memorandums. It travels in tone. The unit is no longer here. Officially, it rotated, restructured, dissolved into successor formations and task group redesignations. Names changed. Patch colors shifted. Some of the men dispersed into training commands, others into advisory roles. A few stepped out of uniform entirely, carrying quiet resumes and stories they will never fully tell. But reputations do not disband so neatly. Sergeant Liam Locke Carver left the regiment 3 years after the exercise that cracked a doctrine wide open. He works civilian security now, a job that values discipline but rarely understands the psychology behind it. Sometimes, in quiet parking garages at night, he catches himself scanning corners the way he did in that unmarked terrain between expectations. His body still moves before his mind catches up. He does not talk about exercise often. When he does, he avoids the language of triumph. He remembers the silence before movement more than the outcome. He remembers the way the opposing force commander's confidence fractured, not in humiliation, but in slow realization. He remembers understanding, in a way that unsettled him, how thin the membrane is between order and improvisation. Doctrines necessary, he says now, sitting on the edge of a wooden pier miles from any training ground, the tide pulling softly at pylons beneath him. But it's only as good as the assumptions it's built on. He doesn't say that part of him misses the tension, the edge of operating beyond design tolerance, the feeling of being genuinely ungovernable in a controlled environment. Back on base, the regimental sergeant major, older, now voice rougher, posture still iron straight, offers no analysis when asked about that period. No lectures on adaptive warfare, no critiques of bureaucratic rigidity. He pauses longer than expected. They were young, he says finally, and they were sharp. That combination, it doesn't come around often. There's no smile when he says it, no nostalgia polished for cameras. Just something quieter, the awareness that extraordinary capability is rarely tidy, that the same force which unsettles institutions can also protect them. Captain Walsh remembers the first time the unit arrived, the way the air shifted, not louder but denser, the way her clerks instinctively sat straighter, the way small irregularities began appearing. Vehicles parked just outside assigned zones, requests routed sideways instead of up, minor policies interpreted as flexible suggestions rather than fixed rails. Nothing catastrophic, nothing court-martial worthy, just a subtle bending of gravity. She had called it disruption then. Now she calls it stress testing. The warning still circulates, though it has evolved. It no longer names a specific unit. It no longer references a particular exercise. It is passed quietly between administrative officers during handovers, folded into casual advice over mess hall coffee. If they come through, secure what matters. Expect them to test the seams. It is not written down anywhere. It doesn't need to be. The base absorbs stories the way concrete absorbs heat. Nothing visible changes, but something lingers beneath the surface. A particular alertness, a memory of what it felt like when structure met adaptation and discovered it was not absolute. Late afternoon light slants across the parade ground, stretching shadows long and thin. Captain Walsh watches a new intake march across the asphalt, boots striking in synchronized rhythm. Order, predictable, clean. For a moment, she imagines what would happen if that unit, by whatever name it carries, now rolled through the gates tomorrow. Would she tighten procedures preemptively, lock cabinets before they even asked? Or would she leave the seams exposed, curious to see what they might reveal this time? She doesn't answer the question out loud, because the truth is layered. Part of her would brace, part of her would resist, and part of her would resist, and part of her, though she would never admit it in an official brief, would want to see the system tested again, to feel the edges of it, to know where it bends before it breaks. The warning is still out there, it just doesn't have a name attached to it anymore, because it doesn't need one.